Whatever's happening in the major markets of Australia in terms of residential real estate, mainstream media is going to turn it into a national crisis. Back a couple of years ago when prices in Sydney and Melbourne were rising strongly, that was a national crisis because prices were so high, no one could afford to buy. It was a national affordability catastrophe because they extrapolated what was happening in the two biggest cities to the whole of Australia. And so it was a calamity. Then when those markets came to the end of their booms and they went into that post-boom correction phase, that was a calamity as well because prices were falling apparently at their fastest rate ever, and households were depressed about the loss of their property values, and no one's going to spend money in shops and businesses. So that was a crisis as well. And now the Sydney and Melbourne booms has been reignited according to the most recent figures. Media has very quickly sensationalised that and turned that into, once again, a national crisis. Once again, no one can afford to buy, and APRA is going to be forced to change to dampen down the rampant property market. So I'm just going to refer to some of the media treatment of this recent resurgence in property markets, particularly in the two biggest cities. What tends to be a big part of the problem is generalisation as well as sensationalism. But whatever's happening in Sydney and Melbourne, it tends to be extrapolated across the country and turned into a national situation. So media is constantly reporting what's happening in what they call the Australian property market. But essentially they're talking about the two biggest cities. And people living in other parts of Australia, and let's be clear that the vast majority of Australians don't live in Sydney and Melbourne, and so they must often read what's coming out in major newspapers and what they're hearing on television and radio about the so-called Australian property market and wonder what on earth they're talking about because it doesn't relate in any way to what's happening in the local markets. One of the problems also in terms of misinformation is that most writers and analysts, or so-called analysts, are interpreting what's happening with Sydney and Melbourne prices through the prism of interest rate cuts. It's all about interest rates. They're wrong about that, but that's the way they see it in their simplistic analysis. So we've got headline, here's one in the Sydney Morning Herald: Sydney and Melbourne home values surge on low interest rates, and they've turned that into a national situation. So what's happened is one source of data, which is CoreLogic, at the beginning of this month published their figures for November, and that showed major increases in Sydney and Melbourne, not so much in the other major cities of Australia or regional Australia. But according to media, the only cities that matter are Sydney and Melbourne, and the only figures that matter are the ones from CoreLogic. So they treat these figures as absolute fact, oblivious to the fact that there are figures from other sources like Domain, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, SQM Research, and they have actually different numbers. Quite often they contradict the figures from CoreLogic, but they're presented by media as fact. And because there was a big increase in this 1 month, November, from this one source, CoreLogic, that's been turned into a national calamity. Prices are rising so fast that markets and the nation generally aren't going to be able to cope with that. So that headline was in the Sydney Morning Herald. Here's one in another online publication saying biggest increase in Aussie home prices in 16 years. Well, simply not so. Many locations across Australia haven't had any increase at all. In many of our cities, such as say Canberra, Perth, Darwin, Brisbane, have not had particularly big increases in the most recent month, if at all. But these articles are telling us that Australian prices right across the country are having their biggest increase in 16 years. Of course, it's that big problem again. Firstly, generalisation, taking the Sydney-Melbourne situation, looking at the national average inflated by Sydney and Melbourne and turning it into a major national sensation, which it isn't. Here's another headline, this one in Business Insider: booming Australian house prices are approaching record high. Again, generalisation. We don't have record booming prices across most of Australia. We have 1 month's figures suggesting a big upturn in Sydney and Melbourne. And on that basis, everyone's just getting completely carried away and writing silly articles with sensationalist clickbait headlines. Here's another one. This one's in the Age newspaper in Melbourne. Too many buyers, not enough sellers leads to sizzling house prices. And again, they're talking about Australian residential property prices nationwide are on a headline-grabbing tear. The floodgates have started to open as cheap money has unleashed pent-up demand and spurred buyers to bid up prices everywhere in Australia, according to this article. But of course, that's not happening. In most parts of Australia, we have moderate markets. Some markets are in downturn, others are rising in a pretty controlled and moderate way. But if you believe media, everywhere is just going crazy and it's a national crisis. Nothing like that's happening. Of course, it was the same when prices were dropping in Sydney and Melbourne. That was turned into the most serious and severe downturn ever in the history of recorded real estate data in Australia, and it was nothing of the sort. While that was going on, there were markets in places like regional Victoria, for example, Hobart, parts of Brisbane, parts of Adelaide, where prices were rising steadily at a fairly controlled rate. But at that time, media was telling us that prices were falling everywhere. They just never seem able to give it right. Why is that? Well, because they don't give a damn. That's the first problem. Secondly, because the people writing the articles aren't experts and they don't really care about accuracy or balance. They should, but they don't. And so we end up with this great seething mass of media misinformation about what's happening in prices. And it's all generalised. They're talking about Australia's one market. If you want to get some sense what's going on, tune into hotspotting.com.au, get our regular newsletters, which are free, or some of our regular reports like the Ryder report, our bi-monthly newsletter, which we published the latest edition of, the Christmas edition this week, and find out what's really going on, at the coalface, at a local level, because that's what's important. All this generalised, sensationalised stuff in media is completely worthless information. It doesn't tell you anything that's useful. It's mostly misinformation, but really what you need to know is, what's happening at a local level in the areas you're interested in, and that's where we come in. That's it for now. That's this week's War on Misinformation. We'll do it again, same time next week. Bye for now.